Las Vegas, 2011. A quiet, aging man, gray at the temples and soft-spoken, sits in the corner of a police interrogation room. He gives his name as Joseph Richard Sandelli, a casino worker, known by his colleagues as the man who never spoke much, who showed up early, and always left with his head down. To them, he was harmless, invisible, unremarkable. But that night, as investigators pressed him with questions, something extraordinary happened. A fingerprint skin blinked on the screen, searching, matching, confirming. The name that came back wasn't Joseph Sandelli. It was Arthur Gerald Jones. A man who, according to official records, had been dead for 25 years. For a long moment, the room fell silent. The detectives stared at him, their disbelief hanging in the air. He wasn't a missing person returning home. He wasn't a man found after years of captivity. He was a man who had faked his death, and succeeded. For over 3 decades, he had lived a second life, under borrowed names and false papers, working in the shadows of Las Vegas casinos, hiding behind a lie so complete it fooled his own family, the IRS, and the world. Imagine that. A man who vanished from the suburbs of Illinois in 1979, a husband, a father of 3, now sitting under fluorescent lights, revealed as the ghost who never really died. What drives a man to erase himself? Was it greed? Fear? Regret? Or the crushing weight of a life he no longer recognized? This is not just the story of a disappearance. It's the story of resurrection, not the holy kind, but the kind born of desperation, deception, and quiet survival. Welcome to the Found Files. Here, we uncover the stories of the missing, those who vanished from their lives, and the truths that refuse to stay buried. Before we begin, take a moment, because stories like this don't just happen to strangers. Somewhere, someone you know could be carrying a secret this heavy. So if you believe every lost story deserves to be found, don't just watch, be part of the search. Subscribe to the Found Files, where every disappearance finds its voice again. Now, let's begin with the man who died, but kept living. Before he became a ghost, Arthur Gerald Jones was a man who had everything most people spend their lives chasing. In the mid-1970s, he was known around Highland Park, Illinois, a quiet, tree-lined suburb north of Chicago, as a respected commodities broker. He wore neatly pressed suits, drove a polished car, and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who believed his future was secure. His name carried weight at the trading floor. He was intelligent, persuasive, and ambitious, the kind of man who could turn numbers into opportunity, and opportunity into wealth. At home, life appeared ordinary in content. He was a husband, a father of 3, living in a modest but comfortable home surrounded by good neighbors and routine. Weekends meant mowing the lawn, little league games, family dinners under the soft hum of the radio. His family saw him as a provider, steady, dependable, the kind of man who held their world together. But beneath the calm surface, something darker was stirring. The Chicago of the late 1970s was a place where fortunes were made and lost overnight. The stock exchange thrived on risk, and Arthur thrived on the rush. He began to gamble, at first small, innocent wagers with friends and colleagues. Then, the bets grew bolder. Cards, horses, the market itself. It was all the same thrill, that dizzying moment between winning and losing everything. And slowly, that thrill began to consume him. Those closest to him noticed the change. Late nights became more frequent. His phone calls more secretive. He grew restless, irritable, distant. Bills went unpaid. Loans piled up. There were whispers that he'd borrowed from dangerous men who didn't take debt lightly. His wife tried to reach him, to understand what was happening, but Arthur had already begun to retreat behind a wall of silence. The man who once laughed at his dinner table now stared into the distance, lost in thought. There are people who vanish all at once, and there are those who begin disappearing long before they ever leave. For Arthur, the process had already begun, piece by piece, moment by moment. In the eyes of Highland Park, he was still the polished broker with a good family and a promising career. But inside, he was unraveling. And soon, that unraveling would push him toward a choice so drastic, it would erase his name from every record, every memory, every trace of who he once was. A man on the edge of losing everything was about to lose himself entirely. It was an ordinary spring morning in May of 1979 when Arthur Gerald Jones walked out of his Highland Park home for the last time. He told his wife he had errands to run. There was nothing unusual about it, no argument, no goodbye that lingered too long. Just a man stepping into the Illinois sunshine, carrying the weight of secrets no one yet understood. But Arthur never came back. That evening, as daylight faded and the dinner grew cold, his wife began to worry. The hours stretched into the night. His car wasn't in the driveway. His phone went unanswered. Panic began to creep in, the kind of quiet panic that builds when logic can no longer explain absence. The next day, his vehicle was found abandoned in a parking lot near a nearby neighborhood. The keys were missing. There were no signs of struggle, no note, no clue, just a silent car that had gone nowhere, belonging to a man who had gone everywhere but home. Police opened an investigation, but every lead seemed to vanish like smoke. There were whispers that Arthur had been in deep with Chicago's underground gambling circles. Others believed he'd been the victim of a hit, a man who owed the wrong people too much money. His wife pleaded for answers. His children asked questions no parent should have to answer. "Where's Dad?" became a refrain echoing through their home, long after neighbors stopped visiting and reporters stopped calling. Days turned to weeks. Weeks to months. And eventually, the trail went cold. By 1986, 7 years of silence later, Arthur's family made a heartbreaking decision. A court in Illinois declared him legally dead. His name was struck from official records. His wife became a widow, his children orphans of a man still walking the earth. But even as the world wrote his ending, Arthur was already writing a new beginning, far from Highland Park, far from the people who once loved him. In one clean break, he had erased himself. No farewell, no funeral, no final moment of closure. Just absence. And somewhere between the Midwest's quiet suburbs and the sunlit highways leading south, Arthur Gerald Jones ceased to exist, and someone else began. A man can vanish in an instant. But the truth? It never truly disappears. When Arthur Gerald Jones disappeared in 1979, most assumed his story had ended. But in truth, it was only the beginning, under a name that wasn't his, in a world that never questioned where he came from. In the weeks after vanishing from Illinois, Arthur drifted south, first through Florida, where anonymity was easy and cash changed hands with no questions asked. He lived small, always moving, always watching. To survive, he needed something powerful, something official. And that's when he found it. Through the black market, Arthur paid $800 for what every ghost needs to live among the living, a new identity. The documents belonged to a real man, Clifton Goodenough, an unsuspecting Illinois resident who had no idea that somewhere, his shadow had just been sold. With that purchase, Arthur was reborn. He was no longer the broker from Highland Park. He was someone else. For a time, he worked odd jobs under different aliases, never staying in one city too long. But by 1988, his wandering brought him west, to Las Vegas, a place built for reinvention. In Vegas, no one cared who you were yesterday. The city glowed with noise and neon, a mirage that welcomed those running from the past. It was perfect. Arthur took a job as a sportsbook writer, later working as a bookmaker. He blended into the rhythm of casino life, handling bets, crunching odds, trading one addiction for another. The man who once chased profits on Wall Street now traded in wagers, living quietly among gamblers who reminded him of his old self. Under his stolen identity, he paid taxes. He filed paperwork. He played by the rules of a world that didn't know he was breaking them. For decades, he lived this way, paying bills, collecting wages, even renewing identification cards. The system didn't blink. No one ever asked why two men shared the same social security number. And so the ghost kept living. But in that second life, there was no family, no friends who truly knew him. He kept his circle small. Never too close. Never too personal. It was safer that way. He carried his secret like a scar, always covered, never healed. Years turned into decades. The man declared dead was now nearing 70, still working long shifts under flickering casino lights. At night, perhaps he wondered if anyone still thought of him. If his children ever forgave him. If they ever found peace in the grave that bore his name. He was alive, but in every way that mattered, Arthur Gerald Jones no longer existed. He had become what he feared most, a man forgotten. A ghost surviving in the desert. For over 3 decades, the world believed Arthur Gerald Jones was gone, buried somewhere between rumor and regret. But in the quiet machinery of government databases, the first fracture in his carefully built illusion was beginning to form. It started, of all places, with numbers, cold, unfeeling, yet impossible to ignore. In Illinois, the real Clifton Goodenough, the man whose Social Security number Arthur had purchased for $800, was living an ordinary life. He worked, paid taxes, and filed his yearly returns just like millions of others. For years, everything was fine. Until one day, the letters began arriving. Official-looking envelopes from the Internal Revenue Service, warning him about income he'd never earned, thousands of dollars traced to jobs in Nevada, a state he had never set foot in. He dismissed it at first, thinking it was a clerical mistake. But the letters kept coming, and the amounts kept growing. The government's records now claim that he had 2 lives, one in Illinois, and one in the neon-lit casinos of Las Vegas. Confusion turned to frustration. Phone calls to the IRS led nowhere. He was told to verify his documents, to double-check his identity. But the system couldn't comprehend that 2 men were living as one. Meanwhile, in Las Vegas, Arthur continued his routine. He filed taxes using the same stolen number, trusting that the labyrinth of bureaucracy would never catch up. And for a long time, it didn't. The strange duality continued for years. One number. 2 men. 2 lives running parallel, invisible to each other, yet forever linked. Then, sometime in the late 2000s, technology began to evolve. Federal systems started cross-referencing identity data between states, tracking inconsistencies in employment and tax filings. Somewhere in that digital shuffle, the impossible pattern finally surfaced. The Social Security Administration's Fraud Detection Unit noticed that one number was being used in 2 different regions, one by a man in Illinois, another by someone in Las Vegas. The odds of such a coincidence were practically zero. An investigation quietly began. Files were pulled. Addresses compared. Employment records matched. And soon, the evidence converged on a single, aging man in Nevada, one whose paperwork led back to decades of deception. After 32 years, the ghost who had eluded everyone, his family, the police, the IRS, was finally about to meet the one adversary no fugitive can outrun, the truth. The walls of his false life were closing in. The numbers that once kept him alive had turned against him. And in the stillness of that moment, a single realization echoed through the system. Arthur Gerald Jones had been found. For over a decade, Arthur Gerald Jones had been a ghost. Officially dead. His name was etched in the cold ink of a 1979 missing person report, and to the world, his story had ended. But in the dusty glow of Las Vegas, fate was quietly rewriting that ending. It began with something small, a form, an application. A man named Joseph Richard Sandelli tried to renew a driver's license at the Nevada DMV. Routine. Simple. Until the system flagged something strange. His Social Security number wasn't unique, it belonged to another man. A man declared dead in Illinois in 1979. At first, the clerk thought it was a clerical error. But the more they looked, the more the cracks widened. The fingerprints didn't lie. The new man's prints matched those of a long-missing commodities broker from Chicago, Arthur Gerald Jones. The moment of revelation hit like a thunderclap. Investigators reached out to Illinois authorities, piecing together fragments of 2 separate lives, one legitimate, one manufactured. The dead man was alive, living comfortably under a new name in Nevada, working in casinos, blending into the neon hum of a city built on reinvention. When authorities approached him, Jones didn't deny it. His eyes were tired, but his voice calm. He confessed he'd left behind everything, the debts, the danger, the constant pressure of his former life. He admitted that in 1979, he simply walked away. No car crash, no foul play, just a man who couldn't face the ruin closing in. The world saw a fugitive. But behind the mugshot, there was something else, a man who'd been crushed under the weight of failure, trying to build himself again from dust and deception. It was the moment the illusion collapsed. For decades, Jones had convinced everyone, including himself, that he could outrun his past. But the past always catches up. And now, in the glare of truth, a man once thought dead was found, not in a grave, but behind a false name, under desert skies. The narration softens slightly, almost whispering. Sometimes the most haunting ghosts are the ones still walking among us. If you followed Arthur's story this far, don't look away now. Every truth uncovered here at the Found Files reminds us, the past never stays buried. Subscribe, so these stories of the lost, When the news broke, it traveled like a cold wind back to Illinois, through old phone trees, forgotten friends, and a family that had already learned to live with loss. For years, they had grieved Arthur Gerald Jones as a man swallowed by tragedy. His wife had raised their 3 children alone. Birthdays had passed in silence. The world had moved on, but the ache remained. Now, decades later, they were told the unthinkable: he wasn't dead. He had been alive this entire time. There was no cinematic reunion, no joyful embrace at an airport terminal. Instead, there was confusion. Anger. Betrayal. His family had suffered through every headline, every question, every what if. And now they learned that while they mourned, he had been living a second life, in the bright lights of Las Vegas, under the name Joseph Sandelli. To his children, the revelation was like reopening a wound that had barely scarred. How do you forgive a father who chose disappearance over explanation? How do you grieve a man who never truly died? Arthur, now gray and weathered, tried to explain his choices, the financial ruin, the gambling debts, the emotional breakdown that drove him to flee. But time had eroded the bridge between him and those he left behind. His words could not span the decades of absence. The man who once built a life of ambition had spent years surviving in silence, only to find that his greatest loss wasn't money or status. It was a connection. The faces he abandoned were no longer waiting for him. In the aftermath, the world saw a story of fraud, deceit, and desperation. But beneath that headline was something more human, a story about how far a man can fall when shame outweighs hope. Arthur Jones had disappeared to escape failure, only to find himself trapped inside a new kind of prison, one built from regret. The narration lowers to a reflective tone. He vanished to find freedom, but freedom costs more when it's stolen from those who loved you. Arthur Gerald Jones's story doesn't end with handcuffs or headlines. It ends in silence, the kind that lingers after decades of pretending, the kind that forces a man to face the reflection he's been running from. In the stillness of his later years, Arthur found himself alone, not in a casino, not behind a fake name, but in the truth he had long avoided. He had outsmarted the system, but not the weight of conscience. He had outrun his past, but not the love he left behind. For the family in Illinois, there were no neat endings. No late-night phone calls or tearful reunions. Just an understanding that closure doesn't always come wrapped in forgiveness, sometimes, it comes in acceptance. Arthur's disappearance wasn't about adventure or greed. It was about the quiet collapse of a man who couldn't face his own failure. And in that collapse lies a painful truth about humanity. Sometimes, people disappear not to escape others, but to escape themselves. But even in that darkness, there's light. Because every story like this reminds us that truth endures. No matter how many names we change, how far we run, or how many years pass, it waits. It waits for the phone call. For the file to resurface. For someone, somewhere, to say, "We found him." And when that truth is found, it gives every grieving family, Every cold case investigator, every lost soul, a reason to believe that silence is never the end. Hope after the silence, that's what keeps us searching. If this story moved you, don't just scroll past. Every share, every comment, every subscription helps keep these forgotten lives remembered. This is the Found Files, where the lost are never truly gone, they're just waiting to be found.